I never imagined that saying yes to a horseback riding lesson would end up changing the direction of my life. At 26, I had somehow managed to avoid horses completely. They were always something other people loved, people who grew up in the countryside or spent their weekends posting pictures from ranches. I was a city guy. My weekends usually involved coffee shops, bookstores, and pretending I was going to start jogging on Monday. So when my coworker canceled our weekend plans at the last minute, I found myself scrolling through random local experiences online. Cooking classes, kayaking, wine tasting. Then one listing caught my eye. First time horseback riding experience. No experience required. I laughed to myself. Why not? If nothing else, I'd probably embarrass myself enough to have a funny story for work on Monday. The ranch was about 40 minutes outside the city, surrounded by rolling green hills that looked almost unreal after months of staring at office buildings. The morning air smelled like fresh grass and pine trees instead of traffic. As soon as I stepped out of my car, I realized one thing. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. People around me looked comfortable, chatting while adjusting riding helmets and boots. Meanwhile, I stood there holding the rental helmet like it was some complicated piece of machinery. First time, the voice came from behind me. I turned around and saw a guy about my age carrying a saddle over one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He was tall, athletic without trying too hard, with messy brown hair escaping from beneath a baseball cap. His smile wasn't overly confident. It was easy, relaxed. I looked that obvious? I asked. He chuckled. A little. I was hoping I looked like a seasoned professional. You look like someone who's wondering which end of the horse is the front. I couldn't help laughing. Okay, that's fair. He set the saddle down beside a fence and extended his hand. I'm Albert. Brandon. We shook hands. I work here on weekends, he explained. Family owns the ranch. Please tell me beginners survive this. Most of them. He paused just long enough for me to question everything. Most? I'm kidding. I don't think you are. He laughed again, and I noticed how genuine it sounded. No one's falling off today. I'll make sure of it. For reasons I couldn't explain, that sentence immediately made me relax. There were 8 people in the beginner group. A middle-aged couple celebrating their anniversary. 3 college friends who spent more time teasing each other than listening to instructions. A woman who admitted she'd been terrified of horses since childhood. And me. Albert introduced everyone to the horses one by one. When he stopped beside a large chestnut horse, he smiled. This is Rusty. Rusty looked at me. I looked at Rusty. Rusty was definitely winning the staring contest. He's deciding whether he likes you, Albert said. Can I make a better first impression somehow? You already are. How? You didn't immediately back away. I considered it. I noticed. Rusty suddenly nudged my shoulder with his nose. I nearly jumped. Albert laughed. Congratulations. For what? He approved your application. I didn't know I was applying. You always are. He showed me how to brush the horse, how to speak calmly, how not to stand directly behind him. Every instruction came with patience instead of judgment. Whenever I made a mistake, and I made plenty, Albert simply corrected it without making me feel ridiculous. You're gripping the lead rope too tightly. Oh, if you're nervous. I am. So is Rusty. I immediately loosened my grip. Sorry, Rusty. Albert smiled. See? What? You're already thinking about the horse instead of yourself. Getting into the saddle turned out to be much harder than I'd expected. I tried once. Failed. Tried again. Still failed. Someone behind me politely pretended not to notice. Albert walked over. Need a little help? I need significantly more than a little. He laughed. You've got this. I appreciate your confidence because I definitely don't have any. He demonstrated everything slowly. Left foot here. Okay. Hold the saddle. Right. Now push. I managed to get halfway before awkwardly sliding back down. I've made a terrible mistake. No, Albert said calmly. You're learning. There has to be an easier hobby. There is. Good. But this one's worth it. Something about the way he said it made me try again. This time, I actually made it into the saddle. I did it. You did. I'd like everyone to remember this moment. I will. There was something in his smile that lingered a second longer than necessary. Not uncomfortable. Just warm. The trail began slowly. Rusty walked at an almost painfully relaxed pace, which suited me perfectly. I kept expecting something dramatic to happen. Instead, the forest around us became quieter with every minute. Birds called from somewhere overhead. Sunlight filtered through tall trees. The only steady sounds were hooves against the dirt path. Albert rode near the front, but occasionally slowed his horse to check on everyone. When he reached me, he smiled. Still alive? Barely. You're doing great. I feel like I'm pretending to know what I'm doing. That's basically everyone's first lesson. You mean even yours? I nearly fell off 3 different times. I don't believe you. It's true. You look way too comfortable. I've had 20 years to practice. That explains it. He nodded toward the trees. Take a deep breath. I did. For the first time in months, my mind actually became quiet. No emails. No deadlines. No phone buzzing every few minutes. Just fresh air. I get it now, I admitted. What? Why people keep coming back? Albert smiled without looking away from the trail. I was wondering how long it would take. About halfway through the ride, the group stopped near a small hill overlooking an open meadow. Everyone climbed off their horses for a short break. I stretched my legs dramatically. I've discovered muscles I didn't know existed. Albert laughed as he handed me a bottle of water. Tomorrow will be worse. You're really selling this experience. I believe in honesty. You could have lied. I don't think you'd believe me. Probably not. For a few moments, we stood side by side looking across the valley. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. It was strangely peaceful. So, Albert said, so, think you'll come back? I looked toward Rusty, who seemed perfectly content eating grass as if he hadn't just carried a complete beginner through the woods. I wasn't planning to. Albert nodded once. Fair enough. But, he looked at me. I think I might. A slow smile spread across his face. I had a feeling. I couldn't explain why, but somehow it felt like he wasn't talking only about horseback riding. And for the first time that morning, I found myself hoping this wouldn't be the last time I saw Albert. I told myself I was coming back because of the horses. That sounded far more reasonable than admitting I'd been thinking about Albert far more than was probably healthy after knowing him for less than 3 hours. Still, the following Saturday, I found myself driving down the same country road with coffee in one hand and an embarrassing amount of anticipation in the other. When the ranch came into view, I caught myself smiling. I hadn't even gotten out of the car yet. That's either a very good sign, I muttered to myself, or a very bad one. As soon as I stepped toward the stable, I heard a familiar voice. I was wondering if you'd actually show up. Albert was carrying 2 buckets of horse feed this time. He looked exactly as relaxed as I remembered, though there was something different in his expression. Recognition. He'd remembered me. I almost didn't, I admitted. Liar. I considered sleeping in. But you didn't. No. He grinned. I knew you wouldn't. You sound very confident. I've gotten pretty good at reading people. And what exactly did you read? He shrugged. That you'd spend the whole week pretending you weren't thinking about horseback riding. I laughed. You're annoyingly close. I usually am. This time there wasn't a beginner group. Instead, Albert explained that returning riders usually received individual practice before joining longer trail rides. So it's just us? For a while. For reasons I couldn't explain, those 3 words made my heart beat just a little faster. He led Rusty out of the stable. The horse recognized me immediately, walking over before Albert even handed me the lead rope. Hey, I said, scratching behind Rusty's ears. I think he remembers you, Albert said. Really? Horses remember people who treat them well. I smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It was. Getting into the saddle went much more smoothly this time. Albert folded his arms dramatically. I'm almost disappointed. Why? I was prepared to rescue you again. You wanted to watch me struggle. A little. I knew it. It was entertaining. I should leave. You won't. I probably won't. He laughed. I'm glad. It was such a simple sentence. But somehow it stayed with me. The lesson focused on steering, posture, and confidence. Confidence was definitely the hardest part. Stop looking at the ground, Albert called. I like knowing where the ground is. The horse already knows. I don't trust him. Rusty flicked one ear backward as if he'd heard me. Albert smiled. I think you hurt his feelings. I apologized last week. Apparently it wasn't enough. You 2 planned this. We definitely did. By the end of the lesson, I was actually laughing more than worrying. Every time I got something right, Albert noticed. Every time I made a mistake, he acted like mistakes were simply part of learning. It had been a long time since someone made failing feel so normal. After the lesson, most visitors headed home. I started walking toward the parking lot before hearing Albert call after me. Hey, Brandon. I turned around. You in a hurry? Not really. He pointed toward the small cafe attached to the ranch. They make surprisingly decent coffee. You work here. I know. So you might be biased. I definitely am. I looked at my watch. I had absolutely nowhere else to be. I guess I could stay for one cup. His smile widened. I was hoping you'd say that. The cafe overlooked one of the larger pastures. Several horses wandered freely beyond the fence, while people sat outside enjoying the afternoon sun. Albert ordered 2 coffees before I could protest. I was going to pay. You can next time. The words slipped out naturally. Next time. Neither of us commented on it. We simply carried our drinks outside. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Where we'd grown up. Our jobs. Favorite movies. The kind of conversations that slowly stop feeling like small talk. So what do you actually do? Albert asked. I'm an architect. His eyebrows lifted. Seriously? Why does everyone react like that? I don't know. What were you expecting? I honestly thought maybe marketing. I have absolutely no idea whether that's a compliment. It wasn't an insult. I'll accept that. He smiled into his coffee. I studied environmental science. What happened? My parents needed help running the ranch. You regret it? Albert looked across the pasture for a long moment before answering. Sometimes. That surprised me. I thought you loved this place. I do. But loving something doesn't mean it was the only life you imagined. There was something honest about the way he said it. Not bitter. Just real. I get that, I said quietly. You do? I spent years trying to become exactly who I thought everyone expected. And I'm still figuring out who I actually am. Albert studied me for a second. I think most people are. Our conversation drifted effortlessly from one topic to another. Travel, music, childhood stories, embarrassing school memories. At one point, Albert admitted he'd once fallen into a pond while trying to impress someone. I laughed so hard people at nearby tables looked over. I'm never letting you forget that. I was 16. Still counts. It absolutely shouldn't. It absolutely does. He pointed at me. I'll wait until you embarrass yourself. I already did that trying to get on Rusty. That's different. How? I like you already. The sentence came out so naturally that neither of us reacted immediately. Then Albert blinked. I smiled. I know what you meant. He rubbed the back of his neck. Right. For a brief moment, he actually looked nervous. It was strangely adorable. Eventually, the conversation shifted toward relationships. Not intentionally. It just happened. So, Albert asked carefully, does your boyfriend ride horses? I laughed. Bold assumption. He looked confused. No boyfriend. No. He stirred his coffee. I would have guessed. What? I don't know. I've been single for over a year. Oh, there was a pause. What about you? I asked. He smiled faintly. Single. Long time. A while. You don't seem like someone who'd have trouble dating. Albert actually laughed at that. You'd be surprised. Maybe. He looked out toward the horses again. I think I spent too much time waiting for life to happen. What do you mean? I kept assuming I'd eventually meet the right person. And I'm starting to think maybe you actually have to leave your comfort zone. I looked around. You literally meet new people every weekend. Yeah. But most of them drive home. For some reason, neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. The afternoon disappeared far too quickly. When I finally stood to leave, neither of us seemed particularly enthusiastic about ending the conversation. Well, yeah, I should probably get going. Albert nodded. Probably. Neither of us moved. Finally, I laughed. This is awkward. A little. He smiled. You coming back next weekend? There it was. The question I'd secretly hoped he'd ask. I was planning to. For another lesson? I looked directly at him. Partly. A slow smile spread across his face. I'll take partly. As I reached my car, I glanced back once. Albert was still standing outside the cafe. When he noticed me looking, he raised one hand in a small wave. I waved back. The drive home felt strangely shorter than usual. Somewhere between the ranch and the city, I realized something. I was no longer counting the days until my next horseback riding lesson. I was counting the days until I saw Albert again. By the third weekend, the drive to the ranch had stopped feeling like an adventure. It was starting to feel familiar. I knew exactly where the road curved around the lake. I knew where the cell signal disappeared for a few minutes. I even caught myself looking forward to the smell of hay and fresh grass before I arrived. That realization probably should have concerned me. Instead, it made me smile. As I parked my car, I spotted Albert repairing part of a wooden fence with an older man who looked enough like him that I immediately guessed they were related. Albert looked up first. His face lit up in a way that made my entire morning unexpectedly better. There he is. The older man glanced toward me before looking back at Albert with an amused smile. This the architect? Albert froze for half a second. Maybe. I walked over, trying not to laugh. So you've been talking about me? Albert looked almost offended. I mentioned lots of people. Sure. His father chuckled. I'm Michael. Brandon. We shook hands. Michael looked between the two of us before smiling knowingly. Albert says you're improving faster than most beginners. Albert cleared his throat. I might have said something like that. I thought you only liked making fun of my writing. I can do both. Michael laughed. I'll leave you two to it. As soon as he walked away, I looked at Albert. You've definitely been talking about me. He sighed dramatically. My parents ask how work is every weekend. And somehow I came up. You did. I feel honored. You shouldn't. I absolutely should. He rolled his eyes, though he was smiling the entire time. Instead of another beginner lesson, Albert surprised me. I have an idea. I usually get nervous when people start sentences like that. You trust Rusty now? I think so. You trust me? That answer came much faster than I expected. Yeah. His expression softened. Good. He pointed toward two horses already saddled. I thought we'd take the North Trail. Just us. Unless you see anyone else. I looked around. The ranch was busy, but no one else seemed to be preparing horses. So this isn't a lesson? Albert shook his head. Call it a ride. I don't know if I'm ready. He smiled. I think you are. The North Trail was quieter than the beginner route. Narrow paths wound through tall pines before opening into fields covered with wildflowers. There were long stretches where neither of us spoke. Surprisingly, the silence never felt awkward. It felt comfortable. Eventually, Albert glanced over. You look different. I do. Less tense. I'm not terrified anymore. I noticed. I actually started looking around instead of staring at Rusty's neck. He laughed. That's usually a good sign. What about you? What about me? You seem happier than the first day. Albert looked ahead for several moments before answering. I think I am. Anything happen? He smiled without looking at me. Maybe. About an hour into the ride, we reached a small clearing overlooking a river. Albert climbed off his horse. We usually stop here. I followed, considerably less awkwardly than my first attempt. I didn't embarrass myself. I'm proud of you. I deserve applause. I'll consider it. We sat on a large fallen tree while the horses wandered nearby, happily eating grass. The only sounds came from flowing water and birds somewhere above us. This place is incredible, I said quietly. My grandfather found it. Seriously? He used to bring my grandmother here. I smiled. That's actually really sweet. He proposed somewhere around here. You're making me feel like I should become more romantic. Albert looked sideways at me. Maybe you already are. The conversation slowed again. Not because we had run out of things to say, because neither of us seemed eager to interrupt the peaceful afternoon. Finally, Albert spoke. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why architecture? I thought about it. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to build birdhouses. Albert listened quietly. I wasn't very good at helping. I doubt that. I mostly handed him the wrong tools. Albert laughed. I can picture that. But I loved watching him create something from nothing. I looked toward the river. I think I chased that feeling. Albert nodded slowly. I understand that. What about horses? I never chose them. No. They were just always here. He looked around at the trees. When I was little, I wanted to be a wildlife photographer. What happened? My dad hurt his back. So you stayed. I stayed. Do you ever regret it? Albert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a small stone and tossed it gently into the river. Some days. And today. He smiled. Today feels like one of the good ones. I wasn't entirely sure why, but hearing that made me happier than it probably should have. As we rode back toward the ranch, clouds slowly gathered overhead. By the time we reached the final stretch of trail, light rain had begun falling. It's just a shower, Albert said. I was hoping horses came with umbrellas. They didn't order that upgrade. I should ask for a refund. The rain became steadier. Not enough to be dangerous. Just enough that both of us started laughing at how quickly we were getting soaked. Albert looked over. You okay? I'm having way more fun than I expected. Good. You? I don't usually ride in the rain. Why not? He smiled. I've never had a reason to. Something about the way he said it lingered in my thoughts all the way back to the stable. Once the horses were settled, Albert handed me a clean towel. You look like you lost an argument with the weather. I definitely did. The weather usually wins. I noticed. Inside the stable, rain tapped steadily against the roof. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. I should probably head home, I finally admitted. Probably. Again, neither of us moved. I laughed. We're getting bad at saying goodbye. We really are. There was a brief silence before Albert spoke again. So, I actually have next Friday off. Oh, I was thinking. He hesitated just enough for me to notice. There's a farmer's market in town. I waited. They have live music. He looked almost embarrassed. And really good homemade pie. I smiled. Are you asking me out? Albert blinked. You can say yes. A laugh escaped him. I guess I am. Then my answer is yes. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then Albert smiled a real, unguarded smile that somehow looked even brighter than the afternoon sun breaking through the rain clouds outside. Good. Good. I was starting to think I'd have to ask a second time. You would have. I would have. As I drove home that evening, my clothes were still damp from the rain, my boots were covered in mud, and my car smelled faintly like horses. I didn't mind any of it, because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't simply looking forward to the weekend. I was looking forward to a date. Friday arrived much slower than I expected. I must have checked the clock at work at least 20 times. Not because I disliked my job, because every hour that passed brought me closer to seeing Albert somewhere that wasn't the ranch. It felt strangely different. Horseback riding had always given us something obvious to talk about. Now there would be no horses, no lessons, no convenient distractions, just the two of us. That realization made me unexpectedly nervous. The farmer's market filled the town square every Friday evening. Wooden stalls stretched down both sides of the street, selling everything from fresh fruit and homemade bread to handmade pottery and paintings. A small local band played acoustic music near the fountain. Families wandered between vendors carrying paper bags full of pastries. It felt warm, comfortable. I spotted Albert before he noticed me. He was standing near a flower stand wearing dark jeans, a light blue button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and sneakers instead of his usual riding boots. For a second, I simply watched him. Without the ranch around him, he somehow looked different. Still unmistakably Albert. Just less like someone working and more like someone enjoying his evening. He looked up. The moment our eyes met, he smiled. There you are. I could say the same. He walked over. I wasn't sure if you'd recognize me. I almost didn't. Oh, I've never seen you without hay on your shirt. He laughed. That's fair. And you're wearing actual shoes. I own more than boots. I had my doubts. He shook his head. I knew this date would involve you making fun of me. You invited me. I did. So this is your own fault. They sold fresh apple cider at one of the first stands. Albert handed me a warm paper cup. You weren't kidding. About what? This place. He looked around proudly. I've been coming here since I was little. I can tell. How? You keep waving at people. He looked slightly embarrassed. Small town. I noticed. Within 15 minutes, he'd greeted what felt like half the market. Former classmates. Neighbors. An elderly couple who immediately asked how his parents were doing. Everyone seemed to know him. You really are famous around here. I absolutely am not. You've stopped walking every 3 minutes to talk to someone. He smiled. Occupational hazard. I kind of like it. You do? It tells me people enjoy seeing you. Albert looked at me for a second before answering quietly. I hope you do too. I definitely do. As the sun slowly lowered, the market became even busier. They wandered between stalls, sampling homemade cheese, laughing at oddly shaped vegetables, and debating which bakery deserved the title of best pie. Albert insisted one stand sold the best blueberry pie in the county. Brandon remained skeptical. I need evidence. You'll get evidence. I'm a difficult customer. I've noticed. You barely know me. I know enough. Oh, you overthink almost everything. Brandon looked genuinely surprised. Do I? Albert nodded. You ask questions before doing anything. That's called being responsible. It's called talking yourself out of enjoying things. Brandon considered that. Maybe. And then, Albert continued, smiling. Once you finally decide to do something, I commit. Completely. Brandon laughed. I guess that's true. Albert looked at him for a moment longer. I like that about you. The words settled gently between them. Neither tried to make the moment bigger than it was. Neither ignored it either. They eventually found an empty bench overlooking the river that ran through town. Music drifted across the water from the market behind them. People walked past in relaxed conversations. "So," Brandon said. "So, you've been asking me questions for weeks." "I have." "My turn." Albert smiled. "Go ahead. What scares you?" Albert blinked. "That's not a small question." "I know." He looked toward the river. "I think." He took his time. "I think disappointing people." Brandon waited. "My parents sacrificed a lot to keep the ranch." He paused. "I always worry I'm not doing enough." Brandon nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling." "You do?" "I've spent most of my life trying to make everyone proud. And it's exhausting." Albert laughed quietly. "Yeah, it really is." Another comfortable silence settled between them. Then Albert asked softly, "What scares you?" Brandon didn't answer immediately. "Being stuck." Albert turned toward him. "I don't mean physically." "I know." Brandon folded his hands together. "I'm afraid of waking up 10 years from now realizing I never actually lived the life I wanted." Albert didn't look away. "I think about that sometimes too." The conversation drifted into lighter territory after that. Favorite vacations. Worst jobs they'd ever had. Childhood pets. Albert admitted that when he was 10, he'd secretly named one of the ranch horses after a superhero. Brandon laughed so hard he nearly spilled his cider. "You cannot tell anyone." "I absolutely will." "You promised nothing." "I definitely didn't." Albert groaned dramatically. "This was a mistake." "Oh, it absolutely was. I trusted you." "That was your second mistake." "What was the first?" "Asking me out." Albert pretended to think. "Actually, what?" "I don't think that was a mistake." Brandon smiled. "No, no." As darkness settled over the town, strings of lights hanging above the market switched on. The entire square glowed softly. The band began playing slower songs. Couples wandered between the stalls. Families packed up purchases before heading home. Neither Brandon nor Albert seemed eager for the evening to end. Eventually, Albert glanced toward the small dance area near the musicians. "I should warn you." "What?" "I can't dance." Brandon looked at him. "I didn't ask." "I know. So why are you warning me?" Albert smiled sheepishly. "Because I was thinking about asking." Brandon laughed. "In public, there are too many people?" "There are definitely too many people." Albert looked almost relieved. "Good. So let's not dance." "Deal." They both laughed. Then Brandon stood. "Come on." Albert looked confused. "Where are we going?" "Walking." "That sounds safer." "It definitely is." They followed a quiet path beside the river where the sounds of the market slowly faded behind them. The evening air had cooled. Streetlights reflected across the calm water. For several minutes, they simply walked side by side, not speaking, just enjoying the company. Eventually, Albert slowed. "I'm glad you came." "I'm glad you asked." "I almost didn't." Brandon looked at him. "Really?" Albert nodded. "I kept thinking maybe you'd say no." "Why would I?" "You barely knew me." "I wanted to change that." Albert smiled. "I'm glad you did." Brandon hesitated before speaking again. So, can I ask one more question?" "You've earned it." "What exactly made you invite me?" Albert laughed quietly. "I was wondering when you'd ask." He looked toward the river before answering. "The first day, when you nearly fell off, Rusty?" I said nearly. "You definitely did." Albert smiled. "You were nervous." "I was terrified. But you kept trying." Brandon listened quietly. "And after everyone else left," Albert continued, "I realized I didn't want our conversation to end." Brandon felt his heart beat just a little faster. "I spent the whole week hoping you'd come back." Albert looked directly at him. "By the second week." He smiled. "I knew I wasn't looking forward to teaching you." "What were you looking forward to?" Albert's expression softened. "Seeing you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was full of everything neither of them was quite ready to say. Then Brandon smiled. "I'm really glad I booked that first riding lesson." Albert laughed. "So am I." Neither of them noticed how late it had become until the market lights behind them began switching off one by one. Neither wanted the evening to end, but both quietly hoped it was only the beginning. After our evening at the farmer's market, something changed. Not dramatically. There was no sudden confession or grand romantic moment. Instead, the uncertainty between us slowly disappeared. Text messages that had once been occasional became part of every day. "Albert, morning." Hope your meetings survive today. Me, that's optimistic. Albert, I believe in miracles. Or later in the evening. Me, guess who accidentally drew an entire floor plan upside down? Albert, please tell me you're joking. Me, I wish I was. Albert, you're still invited back to the ranch. Me, good. I was worried I'd lose my riding privileges. 3 days after our date, my phone rang just after work. Albert, hey. Hey yourself. You busy tomorrow evening? Not unless you've decided I'm finally ready to race horses. He laughed. Definitely not. So what's the plan? I need supplies from the hardware store. I waited. That's the exciting invitation? It gets better. I'm listening. There's a small diner next door. Oh, they make the best burgers in town. So I was wondering if you'd want to come. I smiled without realizing it. You know? What? You could have just said you wanted to see me. There was a brief silence. I wanted to see you. My smile somehow grew even wider. I'll be there. The hardware store was exactly what you'd expect. Paint, tools, garden supplies. Albert wandered confidently through every aisle while I followed behind, carrying things he insisted were absolutely necessary. Do you actually know what all of this does? He looked over his shoulder. Most of it. That's reassuring. You don't trust me? I've seen you lose an argument with blueberry pie. He laughed. That wasn't my fault. It definitely was. At one point, Albert picked up 2 different kinds of screws and stared at them thoughtfully. They look identical. They're completely different. I'll have to take your word for it. He smiled. I forget not everyone spends weekends fixing fences. I spend mine trying not to answer work emails. That sounds much less fun. It definitely is. The diner turned out to be exactly as Albert had promised. Small booths. Old photographs on the walls. A waitress who greeted Albert by name before either of them had even sat down. Everyone knows you. Albert sighed. I grew up here. The waitress smiled at Brandon. Nice to finally meet you. Brandon blinked. Finally. Albert looked horrified. Carol, what? You've been talking about him for weeks. Albert covered his face with one hand. I'm going to move. Carol laughed. Too late. She walked away before Albert could recover. Brandon looked across the table. So, I know. You've been talking about me. I might have mentioned you. Might have. Albert smiled sheepishly. My parents. My sister. Carol. Brandon folded his arms. Anyone else? Albert pretended to think. Rusty. Brandon burst out laughing. You told the horse about me? I spend a lot of time with him. I can't believe this. Albert laughed with him. He was very supportive. I hope so. Dinner lasted nearly 2 hours. Not because they ate slowly. Because every conversation led to another. They talked about childhood dreams again. About traveling. About books they'd never gotten around to reading. About places they still wanted to visit. If you could go anywhere, Brandon asked. Albert thought for a moment. Iceland. I wasn't expecting that. I want to see the northern lights. Brandon nodded. That sounds incredible. What about you? Ireland. Albert smiled. Architecture. And hiking. You hike. I like pretending I hike. Albert laughed. So, walking. Exactly. I can work with that. As they left the diner, the evening air was pleasantly cool. Albert leaned against his truck. I don't really want a night to end. Brandon looked at him. Me neither. Albert hesitated. There's something I should probably tell you. Brandon felt his heartbeat speed up. What is it? Albert rubbed the back of his neck. My sister. The one I haven't met? Yeah. What about her? I told her about you. Brandon blinked. You did? Albert nodded. After the farmer's market. What did you tell her? The truth. And what's the truth? Albert smiled quietly. That there's this guy from the city who booked one riding lesson. Brandon laughed. And somehow keeps showing up. I do. And every time he leaves. Albert looked down for a second before meeting Brandon's eyes again. I already start looking forward to the next time I see him. For a moment, Brandon forgot everything around them. The parking lot. The passing cars. The lights from nearby stores. There was only Albert. You know, Brandon said softly. I spent years believing relationships were supposed to start with fireworks. Albert listened. But this? He smiled. Feels different. Different good. The best kind. Albert's expression relaxed. I was hoping you'd say that. Neither of them rushed the moment. Neither felt like they had to. Finally, Albert spoke. Would it be okay if I held your hand? The question was so simple. So careful. Brandon smiled. I was wondering how long it would take you to ask. Albert laughed quietly. I overthink things. You really do. He reached out slowly. Their hands met naturally, fingers intertwining as if they'd already done it 100 times. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. There was no need. Sometimes silence could say everything. Eventually, Brandon smiled. So, does this mean I'm officially more than your favorite writing student? Albert looked at him with the same warm expression Brandon had started recognizing over the past few weeks. I think you stopped being just my student a long time ago. Brandon couldn't stop smiling. Good. Albert squeezed his hand gently. Good. For the first time in a very long time, neither of them was wondering where this connection might lead. They were simply happy to keep taking the next step together. Holding Albert's hand in the parking lot should have felt like a major milestone. Instead, it felt surprisingly natural. That was what kept catching me off guard. Nothing between us ever seemed rushed. Every step simply felt like the next obvious one. The following weekend, I arrived at the ranch earlier than usual. Very early. So, Albert said as I climbed out of my car. You've noticed? You are exactly 40 minutes early. I might have underestimated traffic. There wasn't any. There wasn't. He folded his arms with an amused smile. You just wanted extra time. Maybe. I'll take maybe. The ranch was unusually quiet. Most visitors wouldn't arrive for another hour. The morning sun had only just climbed above the hills, covering the fields in soft golden light. Albert handed me a second cup of coffee. I figured you'd need this. I appreciate that. I also figured you'd skip breakfast. How do you know me this well already? You get the same expression every time you're hungry. I have a hungry expression. You absolutely do. I'm offended. You'll survive. Instead of heading toward the riding arena, Albert pointed toward the largest pasture. Come on. Where are we going? I want to show you something. They walked through the still, quiet ranch, passing horses that lazily watched them before returning to their breakfast. Everything felt peaceful. No visitors. No lessons. Just the sounds of birds and the occasional quiet snort from a horse. Albert stopped beside a white wooden fence. Several young horses were running freely across the field. They're beautiful, Brandon said. Albert smiled. They're still learning. They seem happy. They are. For a while they simply watched them. Then Albert spoke quietly. You know? What? I haven't had mornings like this in a long time. Brandon looked at him. What do you mean? I usually rush. Work. He rested his elbows on the fence. Everything always feels urgent. And today? Albert smiled. Today doesn't. Around mid-morning, visitors began arriving. Albert slipped naturally back into work mode, greeting guests, answering questions, helping children meet the gentlest horses. Brandon watched from nearby while brushing Rusty. An older woman smiled as she walked past. You must be Brandon. He laughed. Does literally everyone know my name? She smiled warmly. Albert smiles differently when you're here. Before Brandon could answer, she continued toward the stable. A few minutes later, Albert returned carrying riding helmets. What are you smiling about? I'm apparently famous. He groaned. My mother? Not this time. He covered his face. I have a large family. I'm beginning to notice. That afternoon, they joined a small trail ride with 4 other experienced riders. Unlike Brandon's first lesson weeks ago, everything felt comfortable now. Rusty responded to even the smallest movements. Brandon found himself admiring the scenery instead of worrying about staying in the saddle. Halfway through the ride, Albert slowed his horse until they rode side by side. I have a serious question. Brandon raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Maybe. Go ahead. Albert looked ahead casually. Would you ever move out here? Brandon hadn't expected that. The countryside? Albert nodded. Someday. Brandon thought carefully. I used to think absolutely not. And now? I don't know. Albert stayed quiet. Brandon continued. I always believed the city had everything. It doesn't. It has work. Albert laughed. That's not exactly a glowing review. No. Brandon looked across the hills, stretching toward the horizon. It doesn't have this. Albert smiled. I was hoping you'd notice. That evening, after the last visitors had gone home, they sat together on the porch outside the main barn. The sky glowed orange as the sun slowly disappeared behind distant hills. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Eventually, Brandon broke the silence. Can I admit something? Always. I almost canceled that first lesson. Albert looked genuinely surprised. Really? I convinced myself I'd embarrass myself. You did. Brandon laughed. Thanks. You survived. Barely. Albert smiled. I'm glad you came anyway. So am I. Another quiet moment passed. Then Albert said something so softly Brandon almost missed it. I think meeting you changed something. Brandon turned toward him. What? Albert searched for the right words. I spent years believing my life was already decided. The ranch. My routine. My future. He looked toward the fields. Then one random Saturday. He smiled. A nervous architect showed up asking which end of the horse was the front. Brandon covered his face. I'll never escape that. No. Albert laughed. Definitely not. But after that, his smile faded into something gentler. I started imagining different possibilities. Brandon listened without interrupting. I realized I don't actually have to choose between my family's ranch and having my own life. Brandon nodded slowly. You deserve both. Albert looked at him. I think so too. As darkness settled over the ranch, Brandon finally stood. I should drive home. Albert nodded. You should. Neither moved. Again, Brandon laughed. We're still terrible at goodbyes. We're getting worse. I think we are. Albert stepped closer. Brandon. Yeah. I'm really happy you came into my life. The words were simple, completely sincere. Brandon smiled. I was about to say the same thing. Albert looked relieved. You were? Yeah. Brandon hesitated only briefly. I don't think I've ever met someone who makes ordinary days feel important. Albert's eyes softened. I don't think anyone's ever said something like that to me. It's true. A quiet smile spread across Albert's face. Then I hope we have a lot more ordinary days. Brandon looked toward the fields one last time before meeting Albert's eyes again. I think I'd like that very much. As he drove back toward the city that night, Brandon realized something. He no longer measured the distance between the ranch and his apartment in miles. He measured it in how long it would be before he saw Albert again. And somehow, every goodbye was already becoming another reason to look forward to the next hello. By the middle of autumn, the drive to the ranch no longer felt like leaving home. It felt like driving toward it. That thought surprised me the first time it crossed my mind. Home had always been my apartment in the city, the place where my books filled the shelves, where I knew every creak in the floor, where I'd lived for nearly 5 years. But somewhere along the way, another place had quietly become just as important. A ranch surrounded by hills. A horse named Rusty. And Albert. One Saturday morning, I arrived to find Albert loading wooden tables into the back of a trailer. Good timing, he called. I've been told that before. I could use another pair of hands. So this is manual labor? I'm afraid so. I knew there was a catch. He laughed. I'll buy lunch. Now we're negotiating. The ranch was preparing for its annual autumn festival. Families would arrive the next day for horseback rides, pumpkin decorating, local food, and live music. Everyone seemed busy. Albert's parents organized vendors. His sister hung decorations across the main barn. Neighbors arrived carrying boxes of handmade signs and baskets filled with apples. Within 10 minutes, someone handed me a hammer. I've been recruited. Albert smiled. They like you. I've noticed. His sister, Emma, walked past carrying a stack of pumpkins. So, I looked up. So, you really are an architect? I laughed. Apparently, that's my reputation. Albert sighed dramatically. I've made a mistake introducing you to everyone. Emma grinned. Too late. She disappeared toward the barn before Albert could answer. By lunchtime, they had spent hours setting up tables, hanging lights, and arranging benches around the festival grounds. Brandon collapsed onto one of the benches. I've earned food. You've definitely earned food. Albert handed him a sandwich. My reward. Exactly. For several minutes, they ate quietly while watching volunteers prepare the last decorations. Finally, Brandon looked around. I like this. The festival. The community. Albert smiled. I used to take it for granted. And now, I don't anymore. That afternoon, while carrying another stack of chairs, Brandon noticed Albert speaking with an older couple. The conversation seemed polite, but something about Albert's posture changed. He looked uncomfortable. Once the couple walked away, Brandon joined him. You okay? Albert nodded automatically. Yeah. Brandon waited. Albert sighed. Not really. What happened? They were asking. Asking what? The usual. Brandon understood almost immediately. About your future? Albert nodded. When am I taking over the ranch? When am I settling down? When am I getting married? He laughed quietly, though there wasn't much humor in it. I've been answering those questions for years. Brandon leaned against the fence beside him. That sounds exhausting. It is. Albert looked out toward the fields. I don't think people mean any harm. I know. They just assume life follows one path. And yours doesn't. Albert smiled faintly. Not anymore. The conversation stayed with Brandon for the rest of the afternoon. He'd never really considered how different their lives had been growing up. His own family rarely questioned his choices. Albert's entire future had always seemed connected to the ranch. Later, while packing away empty boxes, Brandon finally asked, "Have you told your parents?" Albert stopped folding a cardboard box. "About us?" Brandon nodded. Albert looked thoughtful. "Not yet. You don't have to. I know. But," he smiled softly, "I don't want to hide something that makes me this happy." Brandon felt warmth spread across his chest. "They already know you're important." "How?" "My mother keeps asking why I smile every Saturday." Brandon laughed. "And?" "I told her it was because of someone I met." The festival the next day was even busier than expected. Children laughed as they met the horses. Parents wandered between food stands. Local musicians played throughout the afternoon. Brandon spent most of the day helping wherever he was needed, directing visitors, refilling water stations, keeping younger children entertained while they waited for rides. At one point, Albert walked over carrying 2 cups of hot cider. "I've barely seen you all day." "I've been promoted." "To what?" "Volunteer." Albert smiled. "I like seeing you here." Brandon accepted the cider. "I like being here." Neither noticed Emma watching them from across the courtyard. She smiled quietly before returning to her conversation. As evening approached, the crowd slowly disappeared. The festival had been a success. Everyone looked pleasantly exhausted. Albert's parents thanked the volunteers before people gradually headed home. Eventually, only family remained. Along with Brandon, Albert's mother approached with a warm smile. "You must be tired." "A little. You worked harder than most people who actually live here." Brandon laughed. "I had good supervision." She glanced toward Albert, who was stacking chairs nearby. "I've noticed." There was a brief pause. Then she said something unexpected. "He talks about you every day." Brandon smiled. "I've heard that's becoming a habit." She nodded. "It is." Her expression softened. "I haven't seen him this happy in a very long time." Before Brandon could answer, she gently squeezed his shoulder. "Thank you." She walked away to help her husband. Brandon stood there quietly for a moment. Albert eventually wandered over. "What did my mom say?" Brandon smiled. "Nothing embarrassing." Albert narrowed his eyes. "I don't believe you." "You shouldn't." They both laughed. After everyone else had gone inside, Brandon and Albert remained outside beneath the string lights that still glowed above the empty courtyard. The festival grounds looked completely different now. Peaceful. Quiet. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across the fields. Albert looked around with a satisfied smile. "I think today went well." "I think so too." They sat together on one of the wooden benches. Neither hurried to leave. Finally, Albert spoke. "You know?" "What?" "The first day you came here." Brandon smiled. "The day I nearly lost an argument with Rusty?" Albert laughed. "Exactly. I honestly thought I'd never see you again." "You hit it well." "I tried." "What changed your mind?" Albert looked directly at Brandon. "You came back." He paused. "Then you kept coming back." Brandon smiled. "I wasn't just coming back for the horses. I figured that out eventually." "You did?" "Around the time you started arriving 40 minutes early." Brandon laughed. "So subtle." "You were never subtle." "I thought I was." Albert shook his head. "Not even a little." For a moment, they simply smiled at each other. Then Brandon quietly reached for Albert's hand. Albert looked down at their fingers before looking back up. "I love ordinary moments like this." Brandon nodded. "So do I." The ranch was completely silent now. No visitors. No music. Only the distant sound of horses settling into the evening. Brandon realized something. Months earlier, he had signed up for a horseback riding lesson because he wanted to try something new. He had expected to learn how to ride. Instead, he had found someone who made every ordinary day feel meaningful. And somehow, that had become the greatest adventure of all. Winter arrived quietly. One weekend, the hills around the ranch were covered with a light layer of snow, transforming everything into something almost unrecognizable. The fences looked softer. The trees stood perfectly still. Even the horses seemed calmer, their breath visible in the cold morning air. I parked my car in the familiar spot and smiled before I even turned off the engine. 6 months earlier, this place had been somewhere I'd never heard of. Now it was the first place I wanted to be every weekend. Albert met me outside the stable wearing the thickest jacket I'd ever seen him in. You made it. I almost had to shovel my car out. Worth it. I looked around at the snow-covered fields. Definitely. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Most visitors had canceled because of the weather. The ranch was unusually quiet. Albert poured hot chocolate into 2 travel mugs before leading me toward the same overlook where we'd stopped during my 3rd ride. This place looks completely different, I said. It changes every season. And you never get tired of it? He looked across the valley. I used to think I knew every inch of this place. And now I keep seeing it through your eyes. I looked at him. What does that mean? He smiled. You notice things I stopped noticing years ago. The light. The silence. The smell after it rains. He laughed softly. You remind me why I loved growing up here. We stood together watching snowflakes drift through the air. No one spoke. There was no reason to. Some silences were simply meant to be shared. Eventually I laughed. What? I was just thinking. Dangerous. I know. Albert smiled. What were you thinking? I signed up because I wanted to learn horseback riding. And I think I've spent more time drinking coffee with you than actually riding. He laughed. Probably true. I don't mind. Neither do I. On the way back to the barn, Albert suddenly stopped walking. Brandon. Yeah. I've been thinking about something. His voice sounded more serious than usual. I turned toward him. What is it? You remember when I asked if you could ever imagine living out here? I do. I wasn't asking because I expected an answer. I waited. I was asking because. He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I was trying to imagine my future. The wind moved quietly through the trees around us. And every version of that future, he smiled nervously, included you. For a second, I couldn't find the right words. So I simply stepped closer. Albert laughed quietly. I've completely ruined my carefully planned speech, haven't I? You had a speech? I did. How long? About 3 weeks. I would have liked to hear it. I forgot half of it. I smiled. Good. Good. I like this version better. We returned to the stable where Rusty immediately walked over, expecting attention. I scratched behind his ears. I think he still likes me. Albert folded his arms. I think he decided that on day 1. I've come a long way since then. You have. I looked toward him. So have you. Albert smiled. I know. Later that afternoon, we helped feed the horses before closing the stable for the evening. As we walked toward the parking area, Albert slowed beside me. My parents invited you for dinner next Saturday. They did. They specifically asked. I laughed. I think your family has officially adopted me. My mom would probably agree. And you? Albert looked at me with that same warm expression I'd first noticed months ago. I've been hoping you would stay around for a long time. I reached for his hand. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. Before getting into my car, I looked back one last time. Albert was standing exactly where he'd stood the first day I met him. Only this time, everything was different. There was no uncertainty. No wondering if we'd ever see each other again. No pretending we were just making conversation. We already knew. I'll see you next weekend, I called. Albert smiled. You definitely will. Driving home, I found myself passing the exact spot where, months earlier, I'd laughed at the idea of horseback riding. Back then, I'd been looking for something new to do on a free Saturday. I never expected one spontaneous decision to change my life. People often ask when you know you've met the right person. I used to think it would happen in one unforgettable moment. Now I think it's quieter than that. It's realizing that ordinary mornings become your favorite part of the week. It's finding yourself smiling during the drive home because you're already looking forward to coming back. It's discovering that home slowly starts meaning a person instead of a place. I did learn how to ride a horse. Rusty eventually stopped treating me like a complete beginner. But the best thing I found at that ranch was never waiting in the stable. It was waiting beside the fence that first morning, carrying a saddle over one shoulder and smiling as he asked. First time, funny how one simple question ended up becoming the beginning of everything.